got off the plane in Heathrow, called my mother, and one of the things I said to her was, I said, I can't think who's going to give the eulogy, and I got an awful feeling it's going to have to be me.
The slamming of the massive wooden entryways at Althorpe signaled a point of no return for Diana's sibling. Gripping a corroded, tiny audio tape with trembling fingers, he prepared to rock Great Britain by unveiling a long-buried recording that exposed a dark, unspoken reality regarding Camilla. Acting as the family's protector and the 9th Earl Spencer, Charles had dedicated decades to shielding his sister's painful legacy, yet nothing could have equipped him for the haunting voice hidden deep within a hollowed-out space behind an old childhood painting. This was no emotional farewell or private journal entry. It was the ultimate protection strategy executed by a lonely, desperate princess, targeting the woman systematically displacing her. What secret confessions did Diana capture during her bleakest moments inside Kensington Palace? Why has her brother chosen this exact moment to break nearly 30 years of total silence? And what cold, calculated remarks from Camilla are about to paralyze the British public and permanently fracture the foundations of the monarchy? A heavy stillness had long been a constant presence inside Althorpe House for Charles, the 9th Earl Spencer. On that chilly Tuesday morning, shafts of sunlight pierced through the massive windows of his family's private records room, exposing floating particles of dust. Standing with hands locked behind his back, Charles fixated on a piece of art that had remained hidden from the world for almost 40 years. Painted in oils during the 1970s, the canvas depicted him alongside his older sister Diana during a brief window of carefree youth. Thomas, a highly skilled art restorer, bent over the piece with meticulous care. Though his assignment was standard preservation, removing a decaying wooden backboard to safeguard the fading paint, the air within the room felt thick and oppressive. Charles found himself unable to look away from Diana's painted gaze, which held a raw vulnerability that felt like a tragic warning in retrospect. "The glue is proving remarkably stubborn, my lord," Thomas remarked quietly, sliding a slender metal tool beneath the rim of the heavy oak borders. "Whoever secured this piece intended for it to stay shut," Charles noted with a furrowed brow, drawing nearer. "The framing happened in the late 1980s. Take all the time you need." Exerting slightly more force, Thomas pushed. A sharp snap reverberated through the quiet space like a gunshot. It wasn't the splintering sound of old timber, but an artificial, abrupt crack. The restorer froze instantly, holding his instrument midair. Slowly pulling away the thick back panel, he revealed what lay beneath. Charles stepped forward, his breathing stopping completely. Carved meticulously into the solid oak frame was an engineered, rectangular cavity, deliberate, precise, and entirely concealed. "Thomas," Charles instructed in a quiet but commanding undertone, "leave the room." The technician hesitated, glancing toward the uncovered compartment, but complied with a quick nod. Gathering his equipment, he departed the archive room silently, the heavy mahogany doors clicking shut behind his exit. Surrounded only by the memories of his departed sister, Charles stood solitary in the room. He walked toward the workstation, his chest thumping in a rapid, anxious cadence. With hands shaking slightly, he reached deep into the wooden cavity, his fingertips making contact with a cold object. He brought it out into the sharp morning light to reveal a single dust-covered microcassette. Wrapped tightly around the plastic casing was a folded, yellowed sheet of paper. The prominent blue crest at the top was instantly recognizable as official Kensington Palace stationery, but the handwriting beneath it caused his chest to tighten. The sweeping cursive loops belonged completely to her. It was the identical script that had penned childhood birthday greetings, desperate pleas to journalists, and eventually, her final testament. Carefully unfolding the fragile paper out of fear it would disintegrate, Charles read the words. Though the ink had grown faint over 3 decades, the final directive remained razor-sharp. For Charles, when the boys are old enough to understand, staring at the audio tape in his hand, Charles felt the air leave the room. What forbidden truth had his sister hidden away? And what made it far too perilous for public ears until this very day? Holding the title of the 9th Earl Spencer meant carrying the legacy of 500 years of noble wealth and history. This immense status was visible in the sprawling 13,000-acre domain surrounding him, filled with priceless Van Dyck masterpieces and ceilings covered in pure gold leaf. Yet that vast aristocratic influence felt completely meaningless against the heavy weight of the small object resting in his palm. Suddenly, a vivid memory rushed back into his mind. It was August 1996, inside the plush, velvet-lined drawing room of Kensington Palace when Diana handed him this very artwork to keep safe at Althorpe. He recalled the paralyzing fear reflecting in her blue eyes that afternoon, and how she kept tracking the detailed ceiling fixtures, utterly convinced that British intelligence had bugged her private quarters. She had recently employed an independent audio technician to search her rooms, a sudden action that had deeply confused the royal court. Charles understood now that it wasn't paranoia at all. She had discovered something real. She had been searching for the palace's surveillance tools herself, capturing the very instruments designed to tear her down. Gripping the micro-cassette tightly, Charles picked up the vintage brass telephone on his desk and contacted his director of private security, a former Special Forces operative whose total allegiance was secured by the immense Spencer wealth. "Marcus," Charles commanded, his voice hardening with an aristocratic authority that permitted no debate, "instantly seal the main entrances of Althorpe. Halt all public tours for the entire week. No individual enters or departs these grounds without my explicit signature." "Understood, my lord," Marcus answered through the line without hesitation. "Are we anticipating a specific security threat?" Charles stared down at Diana's final desperate countermeasure, already feeling the toxic ghost of Camilla invading the space. "Not a threat, Marcus," Charles murmured, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone. "A day of reckoning." Charles hurried through the arched corridors of Althorpe, the heavy quietness making his racing heartbeat sound incredibly loud. He made his way down into the estate's reinforced subterranean vault, a fortress constructed from solid steel and centuries-old stone, where the family's most sacred treasures were kept safe from the public. Bypassing the glittering sapphire crowns and ancient royal documents that illustrated his family's vast generational power, his hands searched frantically through a discarded box containing electronics from the 1990s. He pulled out a dusty, battery-operated dictaphone. Clapping the fresh alkaline batteries into place, the loud snap of the plastic cover brought back another sharp memory from his past. It was late autumn, 1995. He had paid a visit to Diana at Kensington Palace just a few days before Prince Charles was scheduled to depart for a secluded weekend at Highgrove House. Charles remembered walking into the main hallway and spotting his sister standing uncomfortably close to her husband's embossed leather bag, her pale fingers resting nervously near the metal locks. When questioned about what she was doing, she covered her sheer panic with a quick, forced smile, pretending to search for a lost pen. Only now, looking at the microcassette in the dim light of the underground vault, did the terrifying logic of that afternoon become clear. She wasn't searching for an object, she was planting one. The tiny surveillance device she had pulled from her own ceiling weeks earlier had been repurposed and slipped under the false lining of the Prince of Wales's travel bags. Seated at a large mahogany table, his breathing shallow, Charles pushed the small tape into the player. The mechanical whirring of the rewind function echoed off the bare stone walls. He halted the machine, his hand hovering over the play control. Every ounce of his aristocratic upbringing told him to destroy the tape to maintain the stability of the throne and protect his young nephews from deeper pain. But a brother's protective devotion completely overrode his noble title. He pressed down on the button. For 10 painful seconds, nothing played except the low hiss of old analog tape. Charles leaned in, focusing every bit of his attention. Then, a heavy thud of a solid oak door shutting broke through the speakers. Following a brief pause, the distinct sound of ice rattling against a crystal glass cut through the air. "Are you absolutely certain the employees have cleared out of the West Wing?" a woman inquired. Charles froze instantly, the color draining from his face. The voice didn't possess Diana's gentle, melancholy tone. It was a raspy, noble cadence filled with a frighteningly casual sense of control. It belonged entirely to Camilla Parker Bowles. "They are gone, darling. It is only us and Mark," a male voice answered the unmistakable, clipped baritone of Prince Charles. Charles Spencer gripped the table edge, his fingers aching as the dark reality hit him. Diana had successfully recorded a highly private meeting at Highgrove. "Excellent," Camilla's voice crackled through the small speaker, her tone turning cold and calculated. "Because our current public relations plan is failing, the public still adores her. We must become significantly more ruthless if we intend to completely break her spirit before the divorce papers are signed." Charles hit the stop button immediately, his chest burning as he realized he had forgotten to breathe. What kind of horrific psychological campaign was Camilla planning to launch to deliberately break the Princess of Wales? And who was this unknown collaborator named Mark, assisting her in orchestrating his sister's downfall? Charles pressed play again, the mechanical click sounding like a gunshot inside the stone chamber. "Mark," Camilla's raspy tone continued. The media leaks regarding her mental health are not destroying her image quickly enough. She is vulnerable, darling. We must take full advantage of that vulnerability before the financial settlement. A third individual spoke up, smooth, clinical, possessing the calculated voice of a heartless public relations operative. We can systematically feed the newspapers more intimate details regarding her eating disorder. We can leak notes from her confidential therapy sessions. Once the public is convinced she is medically unstable, the Queen will have zero options left except to demand an accelerated divorce and strip away her Royal Highness status permanently. Charles Spencer felt a wave of intense physical illness. He was listening directly to the calculated psychological execution of his own sister. The vast inheritance and influence of the Spencer bloodline meant nothing against the institutional power of the monarchy, which was being weaponized by a mistress hiding in the shadows. On the recording, Prince Charles appeared to hesitate, his voice carrying a noticeable tremor of anxiety. If we push her to the edge, the damage to William and Harry will be severe. They are incredibly attached to their mother. I will not have my boys caught in the crossfire of a calculated smear campaign. As the Earl listened to the prince's feeble attempt at defense, a profound, crushing realization washed over him, solving the ultimate mystery of his sister's final, agonizing years. Why hadn't Diana used this explosive recording against her enemies while she was still alive? A sharp memory from Christmas 1995 entered his mind. He envisioned Diana sitting on the floor of her Kensington home, holding a framed photograph of William and Harry while crying uncontrollably. She had whispered to him that the royal institution would prosecute her for treason if they ever discovered what she possessed. Bugging the heir to the British throne constituted a severe criminal act against the crown. Had she leaked this tape, the palace would have utilized it as definitive proof of her mental instability, taking her to court and cutting off her relationship with her children permanently. She chose to endure a humiliating public divorce in complete silence, giving up her own safety and public image just to guarantee she could remain in her sons' lives. The old tape continued to hiss, dragging Charles back to the cold reality of the subterranean bunker. "The children will adapt, Charles," Camilla replied, her voice dropping to a frightening, low whisper that seemed to remove all the oxygen from the room. But as long as she has those official royal protection officers guarding her every single move, she remains completely untouchable. They shield her entirely from our pressure. Ice clinked sharply against the glass once more. "You must convince your mother to officially remove her sovereign security detail," Camilla ordered, her words cutting through the tense atmosphere like an intentional sentence of death. "Leave her to navigate the public streets entirely on her own with the wolves. Without the protection of the crown, the paparazzi will completely overwhelm her. She will break within 12 months. Charles Spencer's blood went cold as he stared at the revolving tape, realizing that the horrific history of the fatal accident in Paris was about to be entirely rewritten. For 3 agonizing weeks, the crushing burden of the microcassette dictated every single second of the Earl's life. The massive, beautiful halls of Althorpe transformed from a sanctuary into a gilded prison. Sleep escaped him completely, leaving his noble composure ruined by bloodshot eyes and a hollow, exhausted face. The pace of his life slowed to a painful crawl as he managed the terrifying reality of what lay in his hands. Releasing the recording meant declaring an all-out war against the British monarchy. Destroying it meant betraying his sister's final wishes. He required absolute verification before making his move. Operating under total secrecy, Charles directed Marcus, his incredibly loyal security chief, to bring a retired British intelligence audio expert onto the estate under the pretense of evaluating fine art. In the soundproof depths of the underground vault, the specialist ran the analog track through highly encrypted digital spectrum equipment. "The background frequencies and tapeware are entirely consistent with consumer-grade recording equipment from the mid-1990s, the expert whispered. His eyes locked onto the green audio waves moving across his screen. "The voice prints are a perfect biometric match. This file is completely untampered with, my lord. Based on a faint television broadcast audible in the background, I can trace this precise recording to the second week of August 1996. Charles felt a sickening knot form in his stomach. August 1996. This was a mere matter of weeks before Diana was officially stripped of her Royal Highness title, and exactly 1 year prior to the fatal, unprotected crash inside the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. "Thank you, David," Charles said, his voice reduced to a dry whisper. "You will be compensated generously for your absolute silence." Left entirely alone in the bunker, Charles stared at the verified tape, A lesser man might have delivered it straight to the BBC or the Sunday newspapers, but a bitter memory flashed through his mind, the image of his sister being deceived and manipulated by Martin Bashir, the very British media establishment that had promised her a platform only to exploit her vulnerabilities. The British press was a toxic entity deeply connected with Buckingham Palace. If he surrendered the recording to them, royal public relations operatives would bury it using high court orders, label it a sophisticated fake, and destroy his nephew's peace of mind just to safeguard the current queen consort. He had to bypass the system entirely. By 7 p.m. on Sunday evening, the mood at Althorp transformed from quiet dread into intense anticipation. Charles stood inside Diana's perfectly preserved childhood bedroom, surrounded by her old floral wallpaper and vintage stuffed toys. Marcus had quietly set up an advanced encrypted streaming device configured to bypass local network blockades and broadcast directly to international social media platforms. "The servers are running, my lord," Marcus reported, stepping away from the lens. "You have a direct, unfiltered connection. The moment you begin speaking, the entire world will hear you." At exactly 8 p.m., Charles Spencer took his seat in front of the camera. He was a man stripped of all noble protections, holding the small, weathered tape up to the bright studio lights. As the digital viewer counter exploded into the millions within mere moments, Charles leaned toward the microphone, prepared to release a truth that had been buried alive. "For 29 years, the public believed my sister lost her security detail solely as a matter of standard protocol," Charles declared, his voice echoing across the international landscape. What explosive recording was he about to broadcast that would tear apart the British establishment and bring the monarchy to its knees? Charles's shaking finger hovered over the play button of the dictaphone, which was now wired directly into the global broadcast feed. His gaze shifted briefly to the small, white-painted wooden bed in the corner of the room, triggering an intense memory of a time long before media cameras became the terrifying strobe lights of his sister's life. He remembered how a young Diana used to seek shelter under those exact floral blankets during intense thunderstorms, crying while covering her ears to block out the sudden, booming noise, a deeply prophetic echo of the blinding camera flashes and the terrible crunch of metal that would eventually take her life inside a Parisian tunnel. Hardening his resolve against the wave of sorrow, Charles pressed down firmly on the heavy plastic button. Across millions of mobile screens, television sets, and radio stations globally, the raw analog crackle of the 1996 microcassette brought the modern world to an instant standstill. Then, the heavy thud of the Highgrove Oak entryway echoed through the digital landscape. The sharp clinking of ice against crystal glass sounded with terrifying, intimate clarity. And then, Camilla's raspy, undeniable voice poured like poison into the ears of a completely paralyzed public. "You must convince your mother to officially remove her sovereign security detail. Leave her to navigate the public streets entirely on her own with the wolves. Without the protection of the crown, the paparazzi will completely overwhelm her. She will break within 12 months." In London, the chaotic rush of Piccadilly Circus ground to an unprecedented, eerie stop as crowds froze, looking up at unauthorized streams of the broadcast displayed on massive digital screens. In packed bars across Edinburgh and Cardiff, heavy glasses were left hanging in midair, the usual loud conversations replaced instantly by a collective, breathless gasp. The sheer predatory cruelty in the voice of their reigning queen consort was not a fabricated rumor or a speculative book. It was raw, undeniable truth, spoken directly by her. Charles did not stop there. Aware that the monarchy's aggressive legal teams would immediately attempt to dismiss the broadcast as an artificial, computer-generated deepfake, he executed his final, devastating countermove. The moment the horrifying recording finished playing, Marcus hit a single key on the secured computer. He instantly transferred the raw audio files along with the British intelligence experts' verification certificates onto thousands of decentralized, open-source servers. The undeniable evidence was instantly copied across the world, making it completely immune to Buckingham Palace's desperate legal interventions. The live stream suddenly went black, leaving a heavy, deafening quietness in its wake. Charles leaned back into his seat, the suffocating weight of a decades-old secret finally leaving his shoulders. Yet, it was instantly replaced by the terrifying reality of what he had just set in motion. Deep inside the secure stone walls of Buckingham Palace, encrypted emergency telephones began ringing loudly in the dark. How would the king answer to undeniable proof of his wife's cold psychological campaign? And what catastrophic, heart-shattering realization was currently paralyzing Prince William and Prince Harry? The consequences were immediate and devastating. Inside the dimly lit bedroom at Althorpe, Charles watched his secured monitors as international news channels descended into total anarchy. BBC presenters struggled through their live segments, their usual polished professionalism shattered as they broadcast the raw tape of the Queen consort repeatedly. Down in London, the iron gates of Buckingham Palace were already surrounded by tens of thousands of stunned, furious citizens holding up glowing phones in the dark night. Yet the official royal institution, typically an incredibly efficient public relations machine, remained completely paralyzed. A stunning two-word statement moved across global news wires. No comment. They were completely trapped. A sudden, sharp vibration broke the heavy silence of the bedroom. Charles looked down at the encrypted satellite phone resting on his desk. It was a private, unlisted number, known only to a tiny circle of his closest relatives. The screen displayed a royal security code belonging to Prince William. Charles stared at the glowing device, an overwhelming wave of sadness washing over his exhausted face. A sharp, painful memory took hold of him. It was September 1997. The cold morning air bit at his skin as he walked side by side with a 15-year-old William behind the carriage carrying Diana's heavy coffin. He recalled the rhythmic sound of the horse's hooves and the quiet tears falling down the young prince's pale face. In his funeral speech that day, Charles had promised the entire world that he would fiercely protect Diana's children from the cold royal machine. For nearly 3 decades, he felt he had fallen short. He had watched them forced to smile, wave, and ultimately show respect to the very woman whose voice was now broadcasting across the earth. With a shaking hand, Charles answered the call. "William," he murmured, his voice cracking under the incredible historic weight of the moment. For a long, painful pause, there was only the sound of heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. When the future King of England finally spoke, his voice lacked any noble authority. It was the broken, desperate voice of a grieving son. "Uncle Charles," William choked out, pure devastation clear through the secure line. Please tell me the technical analysis was incorrect. Tell me she never actually uttered those words." Charles closed his eyes, a single tear moving down his face. "I am so deeply sorry, William. It is an authentic, unaltered analog recording. The voice metrics are flawless. Your mother captured it herself using a device she concealed inside your father's travel bag." A sharp, quiet gasp came through the speaker as the horrific reality finally settled in. The heir to the throne was suddenly facing the undeniable truth that he had spent decades sharing meals with the cold architect of his mother's fatal isolation. The line cut out with a hollow, metallic click. Charles put down the phone while the digital chaos continued on the screens around him. The British royal family was collapsing from the inside out. Now that the public held the digital copy of the truth, there was only one final sacred obligation remaining for the physical object. Where would the Earl Spencer hide the dangerous microcassette to guarantee his sister's spirit could finally rest in peace? The consequences were immediate and devastating. Inside the dimly lit bedroom at Althorpe, Charles watched his secured monitors as international news channels descended into total anarchy. BBC presenters struggled through their live segments, their usual polished professionalism shattered as they broadcast the raw tape of the Queen consort repeatedly. Down in London, the iron gates of Buckingham Palace were already surrounded by tens of thousands of stunned, furious citizens holding up glowing phones in the dark night. Yet, the official royal institution, typically an incredibly efficient public relations machine, remained completely paralyzed. A stunning 2-word statement moved across global news wires. No comment. They are completely trapped. A sudden, sharp vibration broke the heavy silence of the bedroom. Charles looked down at the encrypted satellite phone resting on his desk. It was a private, unlisted number, known only to a tiny circle of his closest relatives. The screen displayed a royal security code belonging to Prince William. Charles stared at the glowing device, an overwhelming wave of sadness washing over his exhausted face. A sharp, painful memory took hold of him. It was September 1997. The cold morning air bit at his skin as he walked side by side with a 15-year-old William behind the carriage, carrying Diana's heavy coffin. He recalled the rhythmic sound of the horse's hooves and the quiet tears falling down the young prince's pale face. In his funeral speech that day, Charles had promised the entire world that he would fiercely protect Diana's children from the cold royal machine. For nearly 3 decades, he felt he had fallen short. He had watched them forced to smile, wave, and ultimately show respect to the very woman whose voice was now broadcasting across the earth. With a shaking hand, Charles answered the call. "William," he murmured, his voice cracking under the incredible historic weight of the moment. For a long, painful pause, there was only the sound of heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. When the future King of England finally spoke, his voice lacked any noble authority. It was the broken, desperate voice of a grieving son. "Uncle Charles," William choked out, pure devastation clear through the secure line. Please tell me the technical analysis was incorrect. Tell me she never actually uttered those words." Charles closed his eyes, a single tear moving down his face. "I am so deeply sorry, William. It is an authentic, unaltered analog recording. The voice metrics are flawless. Your mother captured it herself using a device she concealed inside your father's travel bag." A sharp, quiet gasp came through the speaker as the horrific reality finally settled in. The heir to the throne was suddenly facing the undeniable truth that he had spent decades sharing meals with the cold architect of his mother's fatal isolation. The line cut out with a hollow, metallic click. Charles put down the phone while the digital chaos continued on the screens around him. The British royal family was collapsing from the inside out. Now that the public held the digital copy of the truth, there was only one final sacred obligation remaining for the physical object. Where would the Earl Spencer hide the dangerous microcassette to guarantee his sister's spirit could finally rest in peace? The digital crisis continued to unfold across the secure screens, but the Earl Spencer turned away from the chaotic light, leaving the room in deep shadow. He gripped the worn microcassette, its plastic surface feeling warm in his hand. While the world now possessed the digital version of the recording, the physical artifact, the final desperate act of a frightened mother, still required a permanent hiding place. Charles chose to completely bypass the secure steel bunker in the basement. Instead, pulling on a thick wool coat, he stepped out into the freezing midnight air of the grounds, the sprawling 13,000 acres of Althorpe covered in a dense, moonlit mist. Marcus, his fiercely loyal security director, appeared silently from the damp shadows, his flashlight cutting a bright beam through the fog. "My lord, the palace lawyers will be preparing high court warrants by daybreak. They will certainly attempt to search the estate with federal authorities to capture the physical tape and claim it as property of the crown." Charles kept his pace steady as he walked across the wet grass toward the dark, mirror-like surface of the oval lake. "Let them try, Marcus. They possess zero authority where we are heading." A deep, grounding memory filled Charles as he unfastened the small wooden boat at the water's edge. It was that painful first week of September 1997. He remembered the intense, bitter arguments with the royal family regarding Diana's final resting place. Buckingham Palace had strongly demanded a grand, public royal crypt, a location where the family could forever manage her physical legacy and public image. Charles had firmly refused, choosing instead this isolated, protected island at the center of the Althorpe Lake. He selected it because the deep waters and old trees could safeguard her in death when the public had failed her in life. Now, that identical logic guided his final action. Not even the ruling monarch of the United Kingdom would dare sign a warrant permitting police forces to violate the sacred earth of the princess's burial site. The wooden oars moved silently through the dark water until the front of the boat rested gently against the soft edge of the island. The tall stone monument shone softly under the dim moonlight. Charles stepped onto the shore alone, his shoes sinking slightly into the wet ground. He knelt before the structure, the suffocating weight of the past 30 years finally releasing its tight grip on his heart. Using a small silver pocket knife, Charles carefully cut away a small square of grass at the base of the marble structure. He placed the microcassette gently into the dark soil, wrapping it once more in the old Kensington Palace paper. "It is complete," Charles whispered into the quiet night air, a warm tear finally falling onto the dark earth. "Your voice is liberated. No entity can ever quiet you again." He carefully replaced the grass, smoothing the earth flat, leaving no indication of the historic artifact hidden beneath. Traveling back across the foggy lake, Charles looked back toward the island one last time. The British monarchy was currently facing a devastating reckoning, consumed by the digital flames of a reality they could no longer alter or hide. But here, in the quiet, protected heart of Althorpe, the intense storm had finally passed. The secret was revealed. The landscape was changed forever, and Diana, Princess of Wales, had finally delivered her truth.